Okay, Mila Falcha, welcome to Irish Granny Helen, and it's time for our Saturday book, The Real Marilyn Monroe by Larry Jordan, and I think this may be our last video number 20. If it gets too long, I'll divide it up, but I think it might be one slightly longer video. I'm very sad to come to the end of this book. It has been fabulous, and I've heard really a lot of positive input from everybody. I'm so glad you guys have enjoyed it. And we will be having a conversation with Larry Jordan, the author, soonish. Scheduling is a problem at the moment for various reasons, and anything worth having is worth waiting for. This is debunking the myths and revealing intimate new details of Marilyn's life and her death. So let's just proceed. We are well into the 700s here, pages, an epic masterpiece, and we're on chapter 57, A Snow Job. So now I think I feel I need to preface this, not because I doubt the author. I think he has researched this exhaustively. It is so carefully researched. But in the interests of self-preservation, preface everything with allegedly. We'll be using code names for some of the people involved simply because of current events and their connection to ongoing current events. So, and if this looks a little different, it's because I'm doing it on a different camera, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Okay, chapter 57, A Snow Job. There was a wide scope of lies, according to the author, from the authorities that the media then grabbed onto and presented as facts, and that should sound very familiar to everybody. The press spent a lot of time praising the police and the coroners. They called it an exhaustive investigation, but most people close to her were never even interviewed by the police. People that were there on the night it happened weren't interviewed by the police. Pat Newcomb, her publicity person, stonewalled and refused to cooperate by avoidance more than anything. The interviews they did have were not formal. They weren't under oath. Lawford didn't even get questioned until 1975. Imagine that happening today. Well, it very well might, actually. They had a group that they formed. This is, the coroner got handed the whole investigation. The police bowed out. And the coroner's office established, in their words, not in my words, this is the title they gave the group, the suicide team. So they were going into the investigation based on the assumption that Marilyn had done this to herself, not based on facts, evidence, testimony, nothing like that. They did not know that Peter Lawford had talked to her the night that she died. They didn't pursue it, and because it wasn't known at the time, and they just didn't even ask any of the right questions. Robert Littman, another member of this coroner's team, was doltish. He professed unawareness about another important fact. He claimed that in '62, at the time of his involvement in the case, quote, "I did not see any record of no drugs in the stomach." This is what the end forensic result was, that there were no indications of pills in her stomach. Coroner's office is saying, well, we didn't really, I don't know, I didn't know anything about that. Ask somebody else. So Dr. Greenson, her psychiatrist, died in 1979. And when he died, then Littman came out and said this. He admitted that group created by the coroners didn't consider the murder hypotheses because Coroner Curfew told them that Marilyn did it herself, and their function was solely to consider her state of mind. Thus, Curfew short-circuited the process by declaring a conclusion and then asking the team to reason backwards. So why would this be so? Well, Littman studied under Dr. Greenson, who was his mentor. He said that he had to actually console Greenson about this death, and that he wasn't totally candid when talking to officials. He publicly covered up significant information that Monroe's psychiatrist had revealed to him at the time. Only years later, after Greenson died, did Littman confess that the psychiatrist told him of Marilyn's, quote, close relationship with extremely important men in government that were sexual in nature, and that the men whom Greenson did not identify were nevertheless at the highest level. Littman admitted that he had no real doubt who Greenson was referring to. However, publicly, Greenson denied rumors of Marilyn's involvement with anybody in government, thus once again proving himself to be a liar, contradicting himself. So one of the two things he said that contradicted each other must not have been true. That's just logic. Another member of the team from the coroner, Dr. Norman Tabachnik, also recalled Greenson mentioning two important men in Marilyn's life, and he similarly had no doubt that these were the brothers. Dr. Norman Farborough admitted neither brother was questioned. He said, quote, I'm sure discretion entered into it. Discretion being another word for, I don't know, cover up. Let's see here. August 17th of 62, the coroner had a press conference, and it was kind of a stunning sight. Old white guys with cigars. Let me show you the picture. It's a little too much to take. There we go. Just the demeanor. And they kind of gave the definition of gaslighting in their behavior. Curfew read a prepared statement saying the importance of recognizing in the death of Marilyn Monroe that she was unwittingly and unfortunately she played the greatest role of her career in focusing the attention of every one of us living on the gravity of a worldwide problem which pathetically cries out for a solution. A conference of this kind, I hope, will bring to the attention of the public not only the seriousness of the problem, but equally importantly, what is now being done in Los Angeles County and other parts of the country in an attempt to help those who contemplate self-destruction. He called this whole thing death wish. So immediately the announcement was contextualized as being self-inflicted, with no discussion of the possibility that she might have been murdered. None of the reporters present even brought the question up. Wednesday, they called it very likely part of her previous pattern where she took overdoses of drugs and telephoned somebody to help her. They said she swallowed dozens of pills in a period of seconds. There were no pills in her digestive tract. But they did not mention that there was no evidence of any sort of pill residue in her digestive tract. They did say she had an empty stomach, but they didn't equate the accusation they made with the reality of the findings. Coroner Curfew lied. He said that chloral hydrate and Nembutal were in her internal organs, and they also called her a doctor shopper, and there's no true evidence of that. She saw different doctors for different issues, but most people do that. You know, she went to kind of a GP guy for an ear infection. She went to a gynecologist for gynecological issues. She saw a psychiatrist for emotional guidance. That's hardly doctor shopping. If it is, doctors insist that you shop. This report also said that about her being found nude, that she had not got dressed all day. Well, that's a complete lie. There were people in and out of that house all day long. She had clothes on. So, and if he meant she was just in a robe, that's not true either, because she went out to the store. Contrary to the smear campaign that was going on in the press, Farborough insisted Marilyn was not psychotic. An addict among addicts, she had no physical dependency on drugs. Her intake could be considered light to medium, and she was certainly not mentally unbalanced as far as I could determine. This contradicts the storyline that had been perpetuated to this day that Marilyn Monroe was seriously mentally ill and an out-of-control abuser of prescription drugs. Suspiciously, the newspapers at the time failed to print Dr. Favorow's full statement. Why? Even the video clips of the press conference on YouTube today have been heavily edited to eliminate most of the favorable comments that Farborough made. Once again, why? People who were obviously telling lies, that they saw her popping pills and under the influence, and that's absolutely not true. But the public impression is still that she was unstable and a drug addict, and it's just an example of what happens when the media perpetuates an untruth. Dr. Howard Markle did a PBS News website and said to counteract her insomnia, she often cracked open a Nembutal capsule so that it would be ingested into her, absorbed faster into her bloodstream. Then she would add a chloral hydrate tablet, wash them both down with a tumbler of champagne. She spent her last day in a drug and alcohol-fueled haze. There's no evidence of any of this. In fact, there's plenty of eyewitness evidence absolutely to the contrary and forensic evidence. Oh, I'm at the end of this pad of paper. Hang on just a second. Legal pad number 6. Lots of notes. How are we doing here? Okay. We may have, about an hour and 15 minutes in this video, and I think if I can keep it under that, that's what we will do. So the coroner's conference sidestepped direct press questions about specifics. They left the mystery unsolved, and they really obstructed and prevented further inquiry. There were still scattered rumors and press interest. For example, AP still referred to the thing as shrouded in mystery. And no doubt this alarmed certain well-placed, high-ranking families. Hedda Hopper wrote about Pat Newcomb being in Los Angeles with Pierre Salinger, the White House press secretary, and were he and she in California because local reporters were still asking questions and they were trying to do damage control. Hard to say. Lou Wasserman cut a deal with the AG and the law. If you've been following, you all know who I mean. And the lawsuit went away, the lawsuit with the studio. MCA press traded silence for the dropped suit. That MCA and the press worked out this "we'll drop the suit if you be silent" sort of arrangement, allegedly. The AG planned to throw top MCA men into prison on antitrust charges to break up companies that had mob connections. After she died, the DOJ dropped everything, backed off. So for a while, Curfey's whitewash worked. Greenson was Littman's mentor, and so they were kind of in cahoots. Littman on the panel was disposed to exonerate Greenson and close the case. They were, you might call it a conflict of interest, I don't know. To show you how biased Robert Littman was against any finding that might implicate Dr. Greenson in misconduct, Littman sent him a letter dated August 20th, 62, in which he wrote, quote, "It's a relief for all of us to have this investigation concluded. Thank you for your cooperation. I wish to reiterate my feelings that you have been most unfairly treated by the press. The facts certainly were not reported correctly. In my opinion, of course, you did everything that could possibly be done professionally for Miss Monroe, and there was no negligence." The DA minor also praised Greenson. He was effusive and kind of appallingly fawning. They later claimed that Greenson let Minor listen to tapes of Marilyn Monroe in therapy sessions, secretly taped. And he actually tried to sell the transcripts for 6 figures to set up a scholarship in memory of Dr. Greenson. So, yeah. Noguchi wrote a book later, and he admitted that he did not follow through with the toxicology. He dropped the ball, essentially. And he apologized, but his apologies really ring hollow because his behavior at the time was suspicious and negligent, and he even admitted later there was no evidence to support the final conclusion of self-harm. Curfey in 1962 admitted that in letters going to the police that Marilyn was murdered, but the cops made a thorough check and really could find no indication of foul play. But at the same conference, he said there's no evidence of general decline in Miss Monroe's mental or physical condition. So if it's difficult to find truthful narratives about this, it's because there's so much contradictory stuff out there publicly, coming from the same people. The doctor after doctor contradicts himself or herself. But so many statements from that time claiming that she was pathological exist, pathological in her final days, and yet same people who said that go on to say that she had no indication of decline. So it's what to believe. It was probably declared self-harm, they admit, because she didn't leave a note. By skirting the obvious conclusion and by saying probable when they talked about it, Fox Studio was able to collect $13 million in several insurance policies that they had on her. And this is quite stunning when you hear the details. Cyril Wecht, our hero, forensic scientist, admitted that he still had trouble with the use of the word probable. Quote, "I never in my life have seen a probable self-harm. That's why we have on the autopsy form undetermined natural accident, homicide, self-harm. If you're not sure, you put down undetermined. But probable self-harm is really atypical, indicating to me that the guy who wrote it, I believe it was Noguchi, felt pressured in doing that. Gary Rogers, a retired homicide detective and forensic coroner, concurs and insists that a coroner doesn't have the legal option to say probably. A death can only be classified as self-harm if it can be determined that the individual knew the consequences of their action and that it would end in death and intentionally carried them out. There is a high standard of proof required for a finding like this, as the ruling states, quote, "In most legal cases, the test to be satisfied is a balance of probability, but a determination of self-harm can only be made where there is clear and convincing evidence. There is to be a presumption against that conclusion at the outset, and one must be certain beyond a high degree of probability that this was the cause of death. Where one cannot be absolutely sure and certain, the death must be classified as undetermined." And as we know, they went into the investigation, the coroner's office, assuming that she had emotional problems and what they thought the conclusion was. Let's see here. The same capitulation to undue influence happened at the death of George Reeves, the Superman, TV Superman, and I just did a video on him, and Deborah and I are right now, this next couple of days, working on a little cooperation between the two of us, if you know what I'm saying. So George Reeves, this is one just briefly, because the book does cover it. had just broken up with Toni Mannix, the wife of Eddie Mannix, MGM's fixer, his enforcer. Reeves was shot upstairs while drunk friends partied downstairs. His body was whisked off directly to the morgue against protocol. The crime scene seal was broken. No autopsy was done until his body had been out of the chain of evidence and washed. No tests were done for trace powder on his head or his hands. They have no idea where the gun was in relationship to him. No explanations of the bruises all over his face and chest. Once again, no note. No demeanor previously that would have led one to believe that this would have been the outcome. He too was naked. And it can't be stressed enough. It's very unusual for people to do this naked because people are sort of inherently reluctant to be found like that. There were no fingerprints on the gun. So what, did he wipe the gun after using it? That's very odd. Phyllis Coates, the actress who played Lois Lane, got an hysterical call from Toni Mannix in the middle of the night, about 4:30 in the morning, I think it was. Phyllis said she was hyperventilating and ranting that Reeves had been murdered. Reeves had complained to the city attorney that Toni was harassing him on the phone. Today she would have been considered a stalker. He left most of his estate to her in his will. Eddie Mannix, her husband/thug, was tight with LA Police Chief Parker. Curfey, the coroner, claimed that Reeves was despondent over his career, but actually he had just gotten an offer to star and direct in a new film, and he was quite upbeat about it. Case closed. His mother hired Marilyn Monroe's lawyer, her divorce lawyer, to investigate. Not because he was Marilyn Monroe's lawyer, just coincidentally, Geisler was his name. So let's look at this here a second. There's a couple of stories here about people who had similar situations. Anyway, Geisler, she wanted him to help her find justice, and he very abruptly, after looking at it for about a few weeks, he quit. And he told George Reeves' mother to drop the case because some dangerous people were involved. So apparently he feared that Reeves had been murdered and there was a cover-up. Anyway, 2 years later, the coroner ordered Reeves' body exhumed and cremated without his mother's consent, which prevented anyone from further investigating what happened to him. And why would the coroner do that? There's no rationale unless he was trying to hide something. He had no compunction about destroying evidence. In 1982, he refused to cooperate when officials made a pretense of looking into Marilyn Monroe's death for a second time. His papers remained sealed. 50 boxes of papers remained sealed until the year 2062. A nice long time. So here's a couple of other examples. Noguchi continued with the record of ruling self-harm or an accident, which is not an appropriate way to conclude. It puts the onus and the expense of an investigation on families. They are the ones, if they disagree, they're the ones who have to pay for a new investigation. 38-year-old Gia Scala died in bed, naked, bruised, and lying in a blood-soaked bed. Only 3 Valium were missing, and the story out of her, that wouldn't have done any harm. Made her maybe sleepy, but earlier that day she'd fired 4 workmen who were doing a poor job of something at her house and harassing her. She had to call the police to get them to leave. The embalmer said that she was black and blue all over. The photographs of the crime scene were suppressed. Like with Marilyn, the coroner's aide reported diffuse bruising, and this never got into the final report. Same thing happened with Marilyn. Noguchi ruled Scala's death was an accidental OD. Carol Landis, that name should ring a bell. Pretty young blonde woman from a humble background who, like Marilyn, dyed her hair blonde and suffered from endometriosis, as Marilyn did. She signed a contract at 20th Century Fox, had an affair with Daryl Zanuck. Like Marilyn, she entertained troops abroad. Boy, it seems like a long time ago since we read about that Korean trip. Isn't that funny? She entertained troops abroad, posed for cheesecake photos, launched a successful movie career. The official story is that after she was jilted by actor Rex Harrison, who had promised to divorce his wife and marry Landis, Carol did herself in by taking too much Seconal. Harrison found her while she was still alive and waited hours to notify the police. Like Marilyn, Carol had made plans for the future just before her death, going on a shopping spree and holding a party. Her great-niece said Landis was in a bubbly and radiant mood that 4th of July weekend. Not one friend said that she was down or depressed. She even said, the niece, that she had never seen her happier. She had made a few half-hearted attempts before so that she would be rescued, but was not wrapped up emotionally with Rex. In fact, she was dating 2 other men. Her LA police file mysteriously disappeared. Then we have William Holden, who bled to death from an accidental fall. His head hit a table, but the table was not in its usual place. It was in a very weird position in the middle of the room, kind of like, I don't know, staged. And he was found too many days later to do any kind of toxicology. And his friends, his close friends, have some serious questions about what happened to him. Stephanie Powers, his former girlfriend, got the bulk of his estate. He had left her to marry his longtime former love. Their co-star, Robert Wagner, lost his wife, Natalie Wood, 2 weeks later. Wood's death was also accidental. Noguchi's findings of accident changed in 2012 for Natalie Wood to undetermined. A cop at the time said she looked like the victim of an assault. Even though she was in the water, she looked like the victim of an assault. Christopher Walken, who was a guest on the boat the night that she died, wouldn't talk about it with anybody. And when the press asked him, he said, it's an effing bore. That was his response about his friend's death. In 2018, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office told the press the case was now being investigated as a suspicious death. It released a statement saying, quote, a witness provided details about hearing yelling and crashing sounds coming from the couple's stateroom. Shortly afterwards, separate witnesses identified a man and a woman arguing on the back of the boat, and they thought the voices belonged to Natalie and Robert Wagner. Suddenly, there was a sound of silence. Her sister thinks that, well, I don't want to repeat, I don't want to make the accusations, but process of elimination, somebody present at the scene hit her, she fell overboard, and then she was just left to her own devices, let's put it that way. She couldn't get out of the water. Sadly, something I've read elsewhere is she had an obsessive fear, phobia of drowning her whole life. As a child, she was in a movie and they accidentally created a panicked moment in water and she had to be rescued, and she forever after had a terror of drowning. Chapter 58, it wasn't Camelot, it was Caligula. The New York Journal had a story in June of '63 while the older brother was in Ireland, linking him to a woman called Mariella Novotny, who was part of a Russian call girl ring involving the British Defense Secretary Profumo. Profumo resigned because of the scandal. the older brother was implicated, but not named. It was kept kind of under wraps. The AG threatened reporters of the article that was in the New York Journal even after they showed proof to him. He threatened antitrust suits against the Hearst newspaper chain in retaliation, and the publishers caved in and killed the story. A couple of days later, Hoover told the AG that there was a security investigation going on about this relationship, allegedly. And one with a 27-year-old wife, now this is the older brother, with the 27-year-old wife of the West German sergeant who was in Washington, D.C. with a military mission. Now remember, this was still during, the wall and all that. She was a party girl. She was connected to the highest levels of East German Communist Party functionaries. She was also involved with Bobby Baker, the secretary of the Democratic Party and protege of LBJ. I have a question here to ask Deborah. Are all politicians dirty? I mean, should we just give up? Then we have Bill Thompson, the older brother's best friend and wingman. He saw this German woman at a party and arranged to make her a gift to his buddy. She began name dropping, and she became what was considered a kiss and tell security risk, and probably a Soviet spy, allegedly, maybe. How do we know? We don't know. The rumor has it. The AG got involved and sent guys to warn her off, but then had her and her husband whisked up into an airplane and flown back to Germany with little fanfare. The story leaked in late October of '63. Hoover was approached by the AG to cover it up, but Hoover opened an investigation, and when he was asked by the Associated Press, when the White House was asked by the Associated Press, the White House denied all these links and said that the FBI had found nothing. Just nothing to see here. But this was a big lie. If there was nothing to see, why were they deported? That makes sense, that question. The AG begged Hoover to intervene with the Senate to stop a Senate investigation. Hoover told him, "You go ask the Senate." And this made, the AG sweat. But then he agreed because he feared that his friend LBJ, Hoover's friend LBJ, would get drawn into the scandal, and he wanted to prevent that for him. Hoover met with Mike Mansfield and Everett Dirksen, the majority and minority leaders of the Senate at the time, and said that lots of senators would get implicated, and convince them that it wasn't worth their while to open that hornet's nest and to not investigate. Allegedly, she had relations with Gerald Ford, and Hoover had tapes that he used to pressure Ford to give information about the Warren Commission and witness testimony, and to also to change witness testimony, and also to promote the magic bullet theory. So they used this blackmail. Allegedly, Hoover did. Who knows? They're all dead now. Who knows? Okay. To reiterate about all of this, people who knew her said that power was an aphrodisiac for Marilyn. It wasn't about deep emotional ties. She knew what was up. Susan Strasberg emphasized, not in her worst nightmare would Monroe have wanted to be with the older brother on a permanent basis, and she was very clear to us about this. She was not going to do herself in over the end of a fling, or even the end of the fling with the other brother. Nor was she going to destroy her career by going public with vengeful accusations against them, which would have been totally inconsistent with her past behavior, with her character in general. She might play around, but she was grown up. She wasn't vindictive. Yet, in the final months, she realized that this was serious. This was no longer just fun and games. She was in danger, and she knew it. And she had been warned, she told people, that she'd be murdered and it would be made to look like an accident. And the author comments, you know, like Princess Diana. Joe DiMaggio told his son after the fact that the two related people from outside Boston were responsible, allegedly. FBI Special Agent Curtis Lynham in San Francisco, a 26-year agent with the Bureau, extensively involved in covert intelligence gathering, transmitted a memo to Washington, D.C. from an unnamed source October 24th of 64. It was read by Hoover and others. It purported to implicate the AG, Peter Lawford, Ralph Greenson, Eunice Murray, Pat Newcomb, in a scheme to make her dead. It reported Joe DiMaggio Sr. knows the whole story and reported to have stated that when the AG gets out of office, DiMaggio intends to harm him. This memo claims that after the AG left Los Angeles, he called Lawford from the San Francisco hotel, the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, to make sure that Marilyn was dead. Hang on a second here. LA Police Lieutenant Marion Phillips revealed that in '62, Chief Parker took Marilyn's file to show someone in Washington, and that was the last we saw of it. Correspondence between Parker and the AG in the official library confirms that Parker met confidentially with the AG in December 12, '62 at the Park University Motel in College Park, Maryland. If their meeting had a legitimate purpose, why the clandestine meeting space? Why wouldn't Parker simply have gone to the Department of Justice building in Washington? Good question. Chapter 59, Not Interested in the Truth. False information is repeated endlessly in books and media and has been over the year. And there's a movie, Goddess, that apparently is just not based on truth. In '73, there was a book, the Marler book, which linked Marilyn with the AG. It did the TV mea culpa afterwards. You know, they did a book, and then he went on TV and recanted, and what pressure was put on him and why. Lawford continuously lied about the AG's whereabouts that whole entire time. He was on the East Coast, and then she didn't know him. She didn't know the AG. Robert Statzer, as Larry Jordan puts it, liar, wrote a book in '74 full of lies. He got media attention and said that he and Marilyn married, and actually, this blows my mind. If anybody has listened to my coverage of the book on Dorothy Kilgallen, you will know that in the last period of time before she died mysteriously, she had a guy she was hanging out with, considerably younger than she, called Ron Pataki, who had a very sketchy background. This guy, Robert Statzer, was a longtime friend of Ron Pataki, as I wrote here, of Dorothy Kilgallen fame. So despite lots of writing, legitimate questions are unanswered, and nothing was ever pursued. Grandison, the coroner's aide, in 1982 said that Curfey forced him to sign the death certificate. It would have been appropriate that the coroner, Curfey, sign it. Why didn't he? Why did he get this underling to do it? Grandison's daughter, later, years later, after her father died, said that, she said, my father was a sacrificial lamb in this humongous web of cover-ups. It ruined his life. He lost his job, his dignity, respect in the community, and more importantly, his family. The corruption within the coroner's office and the machinery surrounding it was impossible to fight. He tried, but, you know, they went after him. They framed him and charged him falsely with theft to discredit him. There could have been a few key players, could have been a huge conspiracy. There could have been lots of others. We just don't know. But there's no real knowledge, just speculation. And the reality is that there could have been a lot of people that were peripherally involved, doing little jobs and told to shut their mouths, who were intimidated into silence or willing to stay quiet for personal gain. You know, successful promotions. And this is what helps to perpetuate a cover-up. It could have been just a few. Conspiracies can be kept quiet and can be carried out by a few people. For instance, Lincoln's assassination. They know there were more people involved. They never found out who. The U.S. founding was a gigantic conspiracy. You know, they fought the British Crown and got away with it because they kept it secret while they were working on it. The Manhattan Project, they're, you know, creating this gigantic weapon of unbelievable proportions, and very few people know about it. Area 51. People still think that that's not a thing. It's a thing. Conspiracies and clandestine operations do exist, but it usually takes decades for them to be exposed. For example, in regard to the shocking and premature deaths of JFK, MLK, RFK, Marilyn Monroe, quite possibly Dorothy Kilgallen, we're kept in the dark over 6 decades later. We're not allowed to see the full extent of the evidence. 2062, please. We are not wacko or tinfoil hat wearing loonies. We are just super curious, mentally sharp, hyper aware, and one step ahead of the sleeping masses. In 1985, we've talked about this before, I think. It's getting hard for me to figure out what I did talk about already or not. In 85, Sam Cordova, the grand jury foreman in LA, he called for a new probe into the death of Marilyn Monroe. The Board of Supervisors voted unanimously for the Los Angeles District Attorney to investigate. But what did the DA do? He went to the Superior Court judge and got Cordova fired. This was a crass power play. Said Cordova, I'm scared. I'm scared for myself and my family. This was unheard of. The LA Times then backed up the DA and did a character assassination of Cordova. The thing is, the entire grand jury and the LA Board of Supervisors wanted it too. Noguchi supported the new inquiry, could not rule out murder, he said, and argued that there was overwhelming public interest. The DA, Reiner, is his name, he refused and said there was no indication of homicide. Her friend, Sidney Guilaroff, the last one to talk to her on the phone, who offered, you know, come stay with me or I'll come over to your house, and regretted it the rest of his life. He had a memory of Marilyn's fear in the aftermath of being manhandled earlier that day by the AG and threatening her in her home the last day. He commented, quote, "Then and now I believe there was a conspiracy between the brothers and Dr. Greenson. As far as I'm concerned, the three of them murdered her just as surely as if they had shot her in the head." Anthony Summers, I don't know if Larry Jordan wrote this or if this is just my summary of Larry's really well thought out criticism of Summers, but I wrote, Anthony Summers was full of it. I got a little tired here by the end of the book because I think we've covered a lot about how these people were full of lies and deception and self-aggrandizement and unnecessary false criticism for their own profit. So Anthony Summers is full of it. Ralph Roberts, her good friend, wrote to Summers after he got a call from him about the case. He wrote to Anthony and said, I was quite stunned and bewildered to hear a voice identifying itself as Anthony Summers. I spent the last 7 or 8 years trying to completely erase from my mind anything and everything connected to all those hours of sharing my remembrances of a lady with someone who led me to believe he felt as I did, who said he wanted to show the world such. I had not read the book called Goddess. I had looked up references to me in the index and found my worst fears confirmed. I went to my storage room, gathered all the notes I made during and after our meeting and telephone calls, also notes I made after meeting Donald Spoto, plus various transcripts of calls. As mentioned earlier in this book, Ralph Roberts claimed that Anthony Summers distorted Marilyn's last weeks, including by writing that she was twisting and turning in her bitterness over the brothers. Even though close eyewitness Ralph had told the author she was the exact opposite of that and was in a positive frame of mind. In his letter, he told Summers, I cannot emotionally continue this. The man who was like a brother to Marilyn sharply repudiated the inaccurate way in which she was being falsely written about. He did not even recognize the woman he knew on the pages of Summers' book. He wrote, quote, I remember telling you the very first meeting that I would not have spent 10 minutes with that person portrayed by all the writers, the way that they portrayed Marilyn. That person was not somebody he would have been friends with. You seem to agree I would not have ever wanted to even be introduced to that woman in Goddess. As far as I'm concerned, Rupert Allen put it quite succinctly. Allen had commiserated with Ralph Roberts by saying, quote, I have regretted many, many times introducing you to Anthony Summers. He did have good credentials from England and seemed to be sympathetic to Marilyn. I admit he took us both down the garden path. So people who knew her were very unhappy the way she was portrayed by many, many people in the media, the press, TV, movies, books. Chapter 60, What Happened to the Tapes? So Otash, remember him, the private investigator? He claimed that he had tapes of Marilyn's last day because she was being surveilled and taped by about 5 different groups. See if I can remember them all. It's a challenge. The Mafia, Hoover. I believe Otash was doing it for Hoover, if I'm correct. I could be wrong. Okay, Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, the brothers. Oh, there was another one. Who was it? I don't remember. Anyway, it will probably present itself. So Otash had a long history of involvement with scandals. For example, he was once pressured by the mob to take a husband's name off a list of co-defendants, and later the older brother's name off a list of co-defendants. Soon after, he was met by a mafia guy who asked him to meet on behalf of the AG, and he bowed to that pressure. The mob resented the brothers' lack of appropriate gratitude. They, took the name off this list, and they didn't get the, the never-ending gratitude, the indebtedness they expected. And they wanted dirt on the brothers. They wanted revenge. In 1985, the show 2020 planned a big show on Otash's story, but the story was killed at the last moment. Parts have been seen where he talks about Marilyn, the brothers, and details of her last day. But the head of FBI killed the story. He called it a sleazy gossip column stuff. This head of ABC, close friend of Ethel. His assistant was married to the AG's 5th child as adults. Senior ABC executives had been, a senior ABC executive had been Ted's top aide. So I guess you could call it a conflict of interest. Rune Arledge said there was no evidence that tapes were never found. However, Stanhope Hope Gould, an investigative reporter and TV news field producer who guided broadcaster Cronkite through some of the biggest stories of the 60s and 70s, worked on the ABC Marilyn Monroe story as segment producer, and he said, quote, "It was the documentation coupled with the mob angle that made it a story. The fact that the brothers put themselves in a position to have the nation's most powerful criminals eavesdropping on their affairs with the nation's most famous actress, and that they were exposed to blackmail, that's one hell of a story." He went on to say, "The journalism is solid. Everything in there has two sources. We are documenting that there was a relationship. A variety of witnesses attest to that on camera." And he's talking about 3 people there. She with each one of them separately. Otash's story was backed by 3 wiretappers who heard what was taped. Several witnesses were going to go on camera that she had diaries and told the story to 2020 that she had diaries and they never showed up. Hugh Downs, remember Hugh Downs? Let's see. Hugh Downs indignantly said, "I do not associate myself with sleazy reporting. This so-called sleazy piece was more carefully documented than anything any network ever did during Watergate." Co-anchor Barbara Walters was livid that the story was quashed. Lead reporter Sylvia Chase, I remember her, well regarded by fellow journalists, resigned over this. Geraldo Rivera also left ABC. Even though he did not work on that story, he spoke out publicly and defended the accuracy of the story and was critical of Arledge's decision to kill it. Rivera said he was appalled and shocked by the cancellation. "Such a decision," he said in a phone interview, "has never happened before. The circumstances involved suggest that something other than journalistic standards are involved. The circumstances suggest that cronyism is involved." One of the children of the AG appeared on Geraldo's show in '95 and said, "Quite honestly, Geraldo, you were a victim of the family. The family had become used to hearing the truth about the older brother, but when was at the AG, you see, his wife had a very close relationship with Roone Arledge." So Sylvia Chase resigned. This is what Otash said, because they killed the show for political reasons. It was documented 100%. Most documentation. It was the most documentation the show had ever done for 2020. Ted made a deal with ABC that if they would kill the show, he would not run for president. That's just mind-boggling. A friend of the AG stole the tapes from Otash's wiretappers in a late-night raid. Several people had heard the tapes before that. A lawyer listened and said that you could hear what was going on in Marilyn's home that day and heard the sound of somebody falling. That it was obvious from the sound that there was a violent incident, and he was very nervous about having heard it, having it in his possession. So the home was raided. Search warrant and arrest warrant were, okay, the Spindle was arrested. This is the wiretapper. He was, it was initiated by New York City District Attorney Frank Hogan, but it was out of Frank Hogan's jurisdiction, but he did it anyway. Besides being a friend and close political ally of the AG's, Hogan was notorious for having prosecuted comedian Lenny Bruce in an obscenity case. By the way, the defense attorney for Lenny Bruce was the uncle of, oh my God, my mind just went blank. The grandmother of the second wave women's movement, absolutely wonderful person, and my mind just went blank, but I will remember it if I don't try too hard to think about it. It'll come back to me. We have spoken with her. Absolutely wonderful person. So cops yelled at this guy, "Where are the Monroe dash that family tapes?" Spindell's wife had a heart attack during this raid. It took 9 hours. He was arrested for illegally having phone company property. He even taped the raid, unbeknownst to the people raiding him, and he sued to get the tapes back and failed. The New York DA said that the tapes, oh my gosh, they got lost or stolen or both. Spindell died at the age of 48 in 1972 of a heart attack. If the tapes still exist, they've never been made public. There is one memo left making reference to the AG being at Marilyn's. There are other surveillance tapes. For example, Frank Hronek, Los Angeles DA, monitored the brothers and believed that Marilyn was murdered. In 1962, the Los Angeles Superior Court Commissioner John Dickey did a secret investigation for the chief deputy DA, Manly Bowler, who decided to do it because DA McKesson wouldn't, and confirmed that the AG was at the Beverly Hilton that day staying as a guest. His report disappeared, and in 1985, the LA Times said that Dickey refused an interview and with the, like a follow-up interview, and that Bowler was dead. Numerous memos existed about the FBI in files that peripherally talk about other things, but they talk about Marilyn Monroe and her relationship with the brothers. 2 weeks after her death, an FBI electronics bug recorded a conversation between 3 leading mafia figures, including Meyer Lansky. Quote, "It's big enough to cause a scandal against them. Would the AG like to see a headline about Marilyn Monroe come out about him? How would he like it? He has been in there plenty of times," her house. "It's been a hard affair, and this Pat Newcomb said she used to be in all the time with him, the AG. Do you think it's a secret?" Not a secret. And that wonderful doctor that I mentioned as the grandmother of the second wave women's movement is Dr. Harriet Fraud, and her uncle defended Lenny Bruce, and she lives in New York City, where she has still a thriving she's a psychotherapist, so therapy business. Chapter 62, what the evidence shows. I think I'm going to stop here because I think I have a little too much for... It will make this very long. And I have just enough to make a short video, another short video. So I'm going to stop here and do video number 21. And the book will have reached full maturity. So this is a good place to stop. It's the end of the chapter. So that's always the best place. So thank you for watching. I'll be back here in 1 second my time. I don't know how long it'll take you to get to the second video. It's long as what?